Hi, thanks for joining. This is part two of a lecture on international business or the global context in business. So we spent roughly about 35 minutes or so going through some of the different trade agreements and alliances. We talked about exchange rates and those types of things. Here we're going to talk about forms of competitive advantage as well as different international organizational structures and different levels of involvement. So I'm hoping to keep this to about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll be finished here. I do want to start with the national competitive advantage. Now, a national competitive advantage consists of a couple different areas, and really the idea behind it, the premise of it, the importance, is that in order for me to obtain a national competitive advantage, there are certain things that I have to do first. In order to have an advantage at producing a particular good, certain things have to exist first. And the idea behind this is that no one country can really produce everything that it needs to sustain itself. Based upon where we exist geographically, that predisposes us to doing certain things. Right? In Canada, for example, they have a wealth of Canadian timber that's not grown in any other area of the world. So that is a predominant industry for them. That's a predominant exporting product for them, or exporting good for them, because no one else can get it. They can't grow it anywhere else. It grows in Canada predominantly. Just like in the Middle East, they have a predominance of oil, right? And so that predisposes them to have a competitive advantage in certain areas just because they have an abundance of a particular good, right? They have abundance of that particular good, so to speak. Now, this idea of a national competitive advantage is developed by economists trying to answer the question, why do nations engage in international trade? There obviously has to be a benefit to them, right? They wouldn't do it if it was detrimental to their well-being. They wouldn't do it if it didn't provide them with some type of benefit. So when economists considered this national competitive advantage, they determined that the reason that countries engage in international trade can just be as a result of four factors, four primary things. The first of which was the presence of factors of production, or factor conditions, so to speak. And that includes labor, capital, entrepreneurs, physical resources, and information systems. The presence of these supported a country engaging in international trade. If they had an abundance of cheap labor, for example, that helped them engage in international trade. If they had an abundance of physical resources, that supports them engaging in international trade. If they have an abundance of information resources, once again, that enables them to engage in international trade. So typically countries have to have some type of factor condition present, not all of them, but do one of them very well if they're going to engage in international trade. Next, demand conditions have to be present. There has to be a large consumer base that has a strong demand for products. And that's very, very important to have this present. Usually you have to have domestic demand conditions to exist first. Because in order for a company to get large enough to operate internationally, they first generally have to be successful domestically. And so if there isn't strong domestic demand, there's not going to be enough demand for the products from that company to grow to the level that it would eventually be able to operate internationally. So domestic demand is extremely important in order to groom a country in order to get to the point to where it can operate internationally. A lot of companies that are very large today did not start off as international companies, right? Apple was not an international company for quite some time. But demand for its products, for the computers that they used in the 80s and those types of things, began to increase Apple's dominance, so to speak, or rise to the point to where they were operating internationally now. But it starts with the domestic industries. It starts with domestic consumer groups demanding and having support for certain products. The next one is there needs to be related and supported industries. There has to be a network of suppliers that are going to be able to supply that company with all the little components and things that they need to do to make their product or make the good that they're actually going to be selling. That has to be present. That has to be either strong local or regional suppliers. For example, Apple always had a strong network of suppliers, and even to this day is able to get the little components and chips that they use in a lot of their hardware fairly cheaply. And so that benefits them. That encourages them to operate internationally if I can acquire these things not only quickly, but also in a fairly inexpensive way. Dell, for example, has a great network of suppliers. We all know Dell Computers. They manufacture a lot of different things, but are best known for computers, of course. But they have a lot of their suppliers locate within a certain mile radius of their manufacturing facilities. And the reason they do that is because they want to emphasize what this process is called just-in-time production, meaning that I don't want to have to hold a lot of products in my warehouse because they take up space, it gets stolen, it gets damaged, it's not good. And plus, I may not have a need for it. So instead, they utilize just-in-time production. When an order comes through, that order gets filtered to the manufacturer, gets filtered to all the suppliers, and so everyone knows, hey, Dell needs this particular product. I'm going to go drive it over. And it reduces them having inventory, and it speeds up the process where it would take, days and weeks, months even, to get a computer. They can get it to you in a week or so. They can get it from the time that it's ordered to the time that it gets built and ready to ship is a matter of hours because they utilize that process. But once again, if you don't have strong suppliers in your area, good relationships with them, that's impossible. Fourth is competition. Competition is needed, right? The cream sort of rises to the crop with competition. If there's no competition, there's no incentive for businesses to begin to compete with one another, to try and stress cost reduction, to try and improve their product quality, to try and be more productive, obviously producing more with less, to try and produce more innovative products so they can be the first to market and get the majority of that market share. If there wasn't competition, a lot of that wouldn't be really even apply. We talked about degrees of competition in past lectures and why certain government entities like the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, why they like competition, because it benefits us as consumers in the long run. And so competition is necessary if a country is going to develop a competitive advantage nationally, because they have to ultimately kind of weed each other out, and ultimately the strongest will kind of rise to the top. All right, let's talk about going internationally. Obviously, a company has a decision, whether or not it chooses to operate internationally. And some companies may find it advantageous, some may not want to do it. So how do you determine if it's in your best interest to go internationally? There are three things that you usually have to consider before you do so. The first is gauging international demand. You have to determine, is there going to be enough demand for my particular product to support the increase in capital expenditures, to support the increase in labor costs that I'm going to accrue, the increase in shipping costs, and all those different things that go along with operating internationally, marketing, all those different types of things. Is there enough demand to substantiate doing that? Is there a business reason, a business need for me to actually do this? Just because products are successful in one market, that doesn't mean they're going to be successful in another. Disney had a difficult time putting its Disneyland theme parks in other areas of the world. They were very successful, obviously, in the U.S., but in some other areas of the world, because there's different cultural shifts, it's not as fun, right? Over in Europe, if you don't serve alcohol, that's kind of big for them, right? So when Disneyland didn't offer alcohol in their theme parks, which they don't, at least in most areas, unless you're going to some of those kind of private areas, but for the most part they don't, then I don't really want to do that, because that's kind of part of our culture, so to speak. We like to have a little bit of alcohol. So Disneyland did not do as well in some of those areas of the world. They had to kind of retool, and they ended up closing a couple of theme parks because it was successful in one area of the world didn't translate to success in another area. What happens is a lot of times is products also need to be repurposed or advertised differently in another country. Because once again, some things are important to certain countries. A Costco or a Walmart, how big they are and their selection of products wouldn't work in some other areas of the world, right? Because obviously from a per capita income standpoint, they may not have enough money to purchase things in bulk, which wouldn't make sense for them. But also a lot of other areas, they consider shopping to be kind of a social event, right? It isn't necessarily about going and, buying something. When we go shopping, right, you go shop to shop. You have a list, you're getting that list, Hopefully you don't have to interact with anybody. Heaven forbid. If you can, you're going to use self-checkout so you don't have to talk to that cashier. It's going to get a little chatty, and then you're going to get on with your day. In Europe specifically, shopping is considered to be a social event, right? You go shopping for the purpose of getting to hang out and getting to talk to people and those types of things. And so would that work necessarily? They shop often, right? We try to shop as less as possible. If I can bulk up on things in a couple weeks and go for 2 weeks, then hey, that's great. That's fantastic, right? But Europe, they shop more frequently. They shop for specific meals. So would a Costco or large super Walmart, would it work there? Arguably it wouldn't, right? You might have to scale it down, so to speak, in order to meet their particular needs and meet their interests. Next thing is you have to adapt to your customer needs. All products don't mean the same to everyone. And a lot of fast food chains are very good at doing this because they know that I can't offer the same menu in every single restaurant that I operate, even if they are internationally. McDonald's changes its menu offerings in different areas of the world. They have vegetarian offerings in India. They offer beer in Germany. They have shrimp as in their sandwiches in Japan because those are the local interests. That's what they like. And so why am I going to push them or push on them something that they may not be interested in, right? The whole purpose of me trying to offer something is in hopes that they're going to buy it. So I have to adapt my product to my customer. I have to keep their interests in mind if I'm ultimately going to be successful. Next is this concept of outsourcing and offshoring. Let me differentiate between the two here real quick. Outsourcing, you're really paying someone to do some kind of work that you would normally do. You're paying an outside supplier, you're paying a distributor to perform some work that you could normally do, but really don't feel like you have the time or resources to do it. For example, a lot of companies outsource their payroll and human resource functions because they realize that I don't have the skill set to handle payroll. I don't know the first thing about payroll. I don't want to learn how to use payroll. I don't want to learn how to use the software. It's just a pain. I need to do my core business function and do it well and not worry about payroll. So maybe I'll outsource my payroll function to another company. That's an example of outsourcing. Now, outsourcing to the point to where you send things internationally is called offshoring. So if I, for example, have my call centers housed out of India, then that would be an example of offshoring because although I am technically outsourcing, it is done in a different foreign area. It's a foreign country. So that would be an example of offshoring. But once again, both of the benefits of these is that they allow the company to focus on what they do best, their core activities, also allowing them to reduce costs. A lot of companies outsource their call centers to India in different areas because it's a cheaper labor force than it is in the U.S. here. And if they can obviously reduce those expenses, that can increase their profitability. The same reason why a lot of countries outsource or offshore their manufacturing to Mexico or to China because it's a low-cost area. It's a low-cost labor force. And that reduces my cost, increases my profitability. So let's look at some of the different types of international involvement. Depending upon if you decide to operate internationally, you have to determine how involved do you want to be. And these levels of involvement differentiate based upon the capital requirements to get into it. The more entrenched that you get internationally, the more difficult it is to get out. And you'll see that as we progress through some of these examples here. So the first level of international involvement is having an export or importing business. We went over the idea of an exporter and importer. Exporter being you make the product in one country and sell it in another. Importer being that you buy a product in a foreign market and then bring it back to your domestic market at home to sell. Many companies start off as exporters because it's a lot easier to get into, right? It doesn't require a significant amount of capital. You don't have to set up buildings and pay employees to be into that country, all those different types of things. It's a lot easier to do. It's less of a commitment. And if I want to kind of get my feet wet and test the water, so to speak, this would be a great way to start, is just selling things in different countries. And it's really not that difficult now, too, right? The way that the internet and how significant it is now and all the things that we can do, you can export products to other areas of the world and just sell things online, and then you just ship them yourself. Congratulations, you're an international company, so to speak. Next is a international firm. International firms conduct a large amount of their business abroad. They typically or sometimes can have manufacturing facilities overseas, but they're still considered to be domestic companies for the most part. Considered to be domestic companies that engage in some type of international commerce. But for the most part, all of their products are produced in one country. A primary amount of their workers are housed in one country, but they do some business overseas. They do have some, facilities overseas. Now, a multinational firm designs, produces, and markets their products in many different nations. They have multiple offices in different areas of the world. They have different people in charge of certain operations, and a lot of times they do things without knowing what the other one is doing because they're only concerned about their one market, so to speak, right? So if you're in the Latin American market, that's your baby. That's what you're worried about. You're not concerned about what they're doing in the U.S. very much. You want to get to know the values, the interests, the desires, the wants of your people in that market because you're designing products for them. With an international firm, you may not design them in that country. Maybe you design them in the U.S., and then you might maybe market them or advertise them a little different internationally, but you're not designing them and producing them in a bunch of different countries. Now let's look at some international organizational structures. Now last we determined that there were 3 primary levels of international involvement. Depending upon how invested I want to be, I can choose between those 3 levels of involvement. Now depending upon which level of involvement, either importing and exporting, international firms, or multinational firms, they'll have a different structure set up. And there's 5 primary structures. The first of which is what's known as an independent agent. Independent agent is a foreign company or individual that represents an exporter in a foreign market. An independent agent is something that you would use if you had an import or export business. If that was your level of involvement, you would probably use an independent agent. And the reason that you do is because they're more familiar with that country than you are. They know the people. They know how to sell to them. They know what their desires are. They know what they're looking for. They can tell you whether or not your product will sell because they know they're a member of that society. And we can't pick those same things up because we're not familiar with certain areas of the world. Now, independent agents typically, and because they're independent, they don't represent just one company. They represent a multitude of different companies, obviously. And with an independent agent, you lose control, right? You can't dictate what they say. They don't work for you, so to speak. They're assisting you. They're one part of the supply chain. But they don't work for you specifically. So you lose some control in the message because how do you monitor them all at all hours of the day and what they're telling people that they're selling your goods to? You can't. Next is a licensing arrangement. Commonly it takes the form of a franchise. A licensing arrangement, all that it is it involves a company giving a foreign individual or company the exclusive rights to manufacture and market their products in a particular market. Starbucks had a lot of trouble with this. When Starbucks was deciding whether or not they wanted to expand into China, I believe back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, they wanted to figure out what's the best thing to do. Do we set up our own facilities there? Do we, pay leases and all that kind of stuff and put our employees there? Or do we offer like a franchising arrangement where somebody will pay us a certain base fee to obviously get the Starbucks name and use our logo and get our products and then pay us like royalties over the course of, however long they operate? Or do we do it ourselves? And there's pros and cons to both, right? The benefit of a licensing arrangement is that they're the ones that are incurring the risk. They're the ones that are operating the business. They're paying me a fee to operate my business, so to speak, and I'm getting royalties. How great is that? And I'm not doing any of the work. They're hiring the employees, all those different types of things. So it's a great way to get into an area without committing yourself financially. Another benefit too for licensing arrangements is that you have people who are working as part of the community. They know the people there. They're more comfortable. They're familiar with how to sell, how to talk to those individuals in that foreign market. Now, a primary disadvantage, and the one that Starbucks could not get past, was this loss of control. Starbucks is a significant control freak on their brand, and most companies are for very good reasons, right? They spend a lot of time trying to kind of polish this positive brand image so people view it in a certain positive light. And I don't necessarily want to give this few individuals power over my brand to potentially portray me in a way that I didn't intend. And so eventually Starbucks obviously decided that licensing was not for them. They didn't want to give up so much control, and that wasn't something that they were willing to do. The third type of international organizational structure is a branch office. With a branch office, what you really do is you're actually sending your own people over there to in the nation that you're choosing to go into business to. You're setting up your own facilities there, right? And you're sending your own people, your own managers, so to speak, to hire. So this has its benefits and its disadvantages, right? From its disadvantage standpoint, there's a cost, right? You're physically present there now, right? You have to groom and train somebody to operate internationally, which typically means you have to get them up to speed on the culture and how to do business with them. You want someone with some type of background experience, maybe has lived in that market for some time. So that would be a disadvantage as the cost standpoint. But the advantage is I now have more control because that's my person that I hire doing my work that I tell them to. And so that's the attraction mechanism for that. Also, you can go through what's called a strategic alliance, or some books may refer to it as a joint venture. They basically are the same thing. And what that means is that a company finds a partner in a particular country that it wants to do business with. It has a partner. And they share resources, they share capital, and they cooperate in some mutually beneficial way. And the reason that a strategic alliance is good is because you still maintain some degree of control, but you're also still getting that expertise of that foreign company. So they can tell you when, you know what, the Chevy Nova in Spanish, that means no go. I don't think anybody in Mexico is going to want to buy that. Nah, I think you're crazy. We're still going to do it. Okay, I still think it's a bad idea, right? I bet at one point Chevy wished that they had developed some type of joint venture, right? Because that company would have probably said, hey, you're crazy. You need to change the name. No one's going to buy this thing. Right? They're going to think you're trying to scam them, which nobody ended up buying it because you couldn't get past that it literally translated to no go in Spanish. Why would I buy something that didn't work? Right? I'm not that dumb. Okay? I'm not that dense. So that's some of the issues there. So you're still taking advantage of the expertise of that particular area of the world. You're still taking advantage of the expertise of that country or that company, so to speak, but you still maintain a degree of control. Now, some areas, I know specifically Mexico, requires that in order for a foreign company to do business with them, they have to develop a strategic alliance or a joint venture because they want to make sure that their domestic industries are benefiting in some way, that some of the money is staying in Mexico and not all of it going back to some of these other countries. And the last level of international, or the last organizational structure when going internationally, is a foreign direct investment. And this is buying or establishing tangible assets in another country. You establish your own manufacturing facility, you buy a building and house it with employees, all those different types of things. On a spectrum, this would be the most extreme. It's the greatest capital investment, and it's the most difficult thing to get out of because of the money that you would have invested in the early days. All right, now there are several different barriers to international trade that we're going to go over here. There are social and cultural differences, there are legal and political differences, and there are economic differences as well that we will review. Just to touch on briefly on sociocultural differences real quick, as well as economic, because the next couple of slides are going to go into more detail on legal and political. But sociocultural differences constitute the differences in a society's culture, differences in values, differences in beliefs, differences in language, those things that we kind of take for granted. And so that needs to be considered. That is definitely a barrier to international trade. A barrier for Chevy was that they did not do the research and figure out that the Nova directly translated to no go in Spanish. And they failed to consider that language barrier. And you can find a lot more interesting examples of that if you just do a quick Google search on some of the different missteps that companies have made because they didn't consider, hey, I really wonder what the direct translation is, right? Maybe I should actually ask somebody who's in that country instead of asking my marketing guy that took a couple Spanish classes, right? So those are things that have to be considered in order to do those types of things, right? Lifestyle differences. You know, people have a different change of pace in certain areas of the world. You know, in the U.S., we're very, we like to be productive. We have a high pace, very achievement oriented. We're constantly going, very, very busy. Some of these other areas of the world, they're very much a slower pace, right? France specifically has a slower pace of life. And so maybe some of these different services that benefit us because we're trying to go, 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 may not do well in France because they're like, well, I have some time. I don't need to do that. I'm fine, right? Maybe I don't need all those different services that are convenient because I have more time. I don't work as much. That could be those things. Now, economic differences are the differences in economic systems. And we've talked about economic systems before at the beginning of class. And economic systems obviously being, you know, market systems, mixed market, and planned economies. And so depending on the economic system of a country, it can have an effect on a country's ability to do, or a company's ability to do business there. Okay? Like I said with Mexico, they require that foreign companies develop partnerships with their local businesses with the idea that, you know, some of that money is going to stay in Mexico. And we don't want all of it to leave. We want to maintain some benefit here. And that's kind of the idea. You know, a lot of countries control the factors of production, like China, for example, which is a planned economy. That affects your ability to operate your business effectively if they're controlling, you know, what you can and cannot do, all the different regulations and different types of things. Okay? You know, if you can't find cheap labor because that particular country isn't allowing you to, that affects your business. And then lastly, there's legal and political differences. Legal and political differences we'll go over more specifically here. They're somewhat obvious and somewhat less obvious. But a country essentially sets the conditions for doing business within their borders. Right? There are some countries that have gone so far as to confiscate property of foreign-owned companies. Obviously, you don't want to be in that position, right, where your building and your property gets taken over by the government. Now, there's several different barriers to trade, and I mentioned barriers to trade previously when we were talking about the different trade agreements and alliances, and I'll go over these more specifically here. The first is a quota. A quota is a restriction on the number of something, a number of goods of a certain type that can be imported into a particular country. So you're restricting the amount of them. It's not a tax, you're restricting the number. The U.S. did this back in the 80s to protect the U.S. auto industry. And the reason was you had some of these auto manufacturers in Japan, Toyota and Honda, that were manufacturing these vehicles for very, very cheap and then selling them in the U.S. for very, very cheap, and the U.S. auto industry couldn't compete. There was no way. And so in an effort to protect them from all going out of business, because if I could buy something for way less, I probably will, assuming that it's somewhat good quality and not going to explode, they tried to protect the U.S. auto industry. So they established quotas, only accepting a certain amount of vehicles, you know, from Japan. We'll only accept, you know, 200,000 Toyota Corollas, or, you know, so on and so forth. And they still have quotas in place today. Now, the interesting thing is to get around quotas. What a lot of companies do, or what Toyota and Honda do, as you probably know, is they actually manufacture them in the U.S., right? I mean, you would argue that Toyota, you know, Camrys and Honda Accords, they're probably more American than we actually think, because we have facilities in Georgia and in Ohio that manufacture these cars. And so they're built and assembled here as a way of bypassing quotas, because if it's built here, I mean, it's a domestic vehicle, right? It's already here, so you can't, the quota doesn't apply. The next thing is an embargo. An embargo is a government order to forbid the exportation or importation, more likely, of one product or all products from a particular country. Companies typically, or countries typically, establish embargoes for political reasons, right? It's usually not done for just for fun. Usually we don't agree with a country's government, and so in order to hit them where their wallet is, so to speak, we're going to establish an embargo, meaning that we're not going to accept any of your goods. So now your workers can't send us what they normally produce, which is going to affect them and how, you know, their economic livelihood, so to speak. They're going to get really angry, and they're probably going to come to you and say, hey, why don't you fix this, because I can no longer ship, you know, this cotton over to the U.S. because they have an embargo. So why don't you fix this? So it's designed to put pressure on a government to basically agree to, whatever it is that they're agreeing to. A lot of times embargoes are done because we don't agree with a country's government system, the way that they manage their workers, so to speak, or the way that they deal with the actual citizens. Those are typical reasons why. The U.S. to this day still has an embargo against Cuba for a number of things that they've done in the past and failed to commit to. All right, tariffs. Tariffs are the equivalent of taxes. A tariff is a tax on something that imports. And so the reason that you establish tariffs is because a number of two reasons why. First, you can have revenue tariffs, which revenue tariffs are designed to bring you money, right? They're designed to generate revenue. But we also more commonly have protectionist tariffs. And protectionist tariffs or protective tariffs are designed to protect certain industries. So if I put a 10% tariff on automobiles, now when Honda, when they ship in a Honda Accord, if they were to ship it into the U.S., they now have to pay 10% on the value of that, which in turn means they have to sell it for more to recover that investment. So it's designed to kind of level the playing field a little bit, because now that country has to take into consideration the amount they paid on taxes. They can't sell it for as cheap as they wanted to originally. They have to increase the price somewhat to actually take into account for that expenditure. And lastly, there are subsidies. Subsidies are government payments. They're designed to help a domestic business compete with foreign firms. It's almost like a reverse tariff. It's designed to reduce the cost of a domestic good, whereas tariffs are designed to increase the costs of foreign goods. Once again, designed to help countries compete with one another, or help a industry compete with foreign market. Now next, this concept of protectionism. This is one that's been talked about fairly frequently, and the reason for that is we want to understand, do we want to protect our domestic businesses at the expense of free market trade, right? There's proponents that argue that tariffs and quotas protect domestic industries and also jobs from going to some of these low-cost labor areas. So we need to do these things, right? Proponents argue that national security is of great importance. I don't want all of my missiles to be manufactured in Iraq. That's not a good thing, right? Because if we get to the point where it's war, they have all my missiles. This isn't a good thing. I don't want all my tanks manufactured in Europe. Because if something goes wrong, if we have a disagreement with Europe, well, now where am I going to get my tanks from? Right? Same thing with airplanes, so on and so forth. So maybe from a standpoint, we should, for national security reasons, manufacture all that stuff in the U.S. because in the event that we get into a potential conflict on a worldwide scale, we may not be able to rely on those countries to ship us the very things that we're going to use against them. Now, critics of protectionism obviously argue that it's a source of irritation between countries. And I alluded to this before, because if you enact a tariff on me, I'm going to enact a tariff on you, right? That's kind of how it works. And so are we really getting to a point where we're trying to one-up each other, and all the while we're reducing our ability to engage in free trade with one another? That can be very problematic. So instead, why don't we work together on a solution versus enacting tariffs and quotas all across the board, and all the while we're hurting our local businesses? All right, I believe this is the last slide here, so I think we're making pretty good time. The fourth barrier to trade that's commonly used by countries is what are known as local content laws. Local content laws basically require that products that are sold in a country be at least partially made there. Not fully, but there has to be some type of value that that home country adds. The reason that they do that is because, once again, you're not only trying to protect your own domestic industries, but you're trying to make sure that at least that country or that company uses your own domestic factors of production in some way, right? Well, at least we're creating some jobs. It makes it more palatable because at least some of my workers assisted in the implementation or assisted in the creation of this, so to speak. Business practice laws are basically the host country creating all of the laws that govern those particular businesses. And this is obviously extreme importance as well. I mentioned before that Google obviously didn't agree with the Chinese government's desire to censor its search results, so they decided not to offer those particular search results for quite some time. We need to be obviously cognizant over what are the laws in that particular country before going into them. That can be a very a very difficult issue and a very much a kind of a barrier to entering a market if they don't allow me to do certain things that are considered kind of part of my business practices, right? They're things that I've always done. And last legal and political differences I'll review here are cartels and dumping. Cartels and dumping are considered to be illegal kind of barriers to trade, so to speak. Cartels are basically associations of producers that control supply and prices. Obviously in the U.S. we don't necessarily like that, right? Because we want our supply and prices to be controlled based upon supply and demand. And so cartels can affect the supply of something to ultimately affect the price, right? We talked about the law of supply and law of demand and the changes that happens, right? If something is in greater supply, then maybe you can't charge as much. If something is in lower supply, maybe you can charge more, especially if it's something that everybody wants, like oil, for example. Now, dumping is selling a product abroad for less than the cost to produce it at home. And there are laws against, there are anti-dumping laws. Because what we don't want is for a company to manufacture a lot of something and then realize, well, I don't really have a use for it. You know, I'm going to dump 500,000 of this cheaply made cell phone in this market, and that's going to hurt domestic business, is kind of what the idea is. And so there are laws against that. You can't sell that for significantly less than your cost to produce it at home because you're intending to harm local businesses. All right, well, that sums everything up for this brief lecture here. I hope you found some of the information somewhat useful. Like I said, as we continue to increase in terms of technology and how prevalent that is, we are becoming increasingly intertwined as economies. And so it's important to just sit back and reflect on, really the products and the services that we use. I mean, how did those come to be? That cell phone that you probably have in your hand right there, how did that come to be? What were the components that were used in there? And you begin to realize that we aren't so independent, right? The products that we use, the computer that I'm looking at here, the keyboard that I look at, the telephone that I'm looking at, all these different things, they probably weren't manufactured here. So we have a very significant impact, and other countries have a very significant impact on us. And we need to be aware of these different types of things and work together, obviously, if we're going to operate increasingly as a world economy. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Have a great week. Hopefully we'll see you soon.